You need to understand something right now before we go any further into this video. What I'm about to reveal to you is the most shocking backstage political maneuvering WWE has seen in decades, and it involves two men who were once inseparable, two men whose names have been synonymous with each other for 20 years, two men who built empires together and are now on the verge of destroying each other in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Paul Heyman, the advocate, the special counsel to Roman Reigns, the wise man of the bloodline, the man who has stood by Brock Lesnar through thick and thin since the early 2000s, has officially requested that WWE fire Brock Lesnar. Not suspend him. Not send him home for a cooling-off period. Fire him. Terminate his contract. Remove him from the company permanently. And Nick Aldis, the SmackDown general manager who has been trying to maintain order on the Blue brand for months now, has denied that request, which means we are heading toward an absolute collision course that could tear SmackDown apart at the seams and create the most dangerous and unpredictable environment WWE television has seen in years. I have sources. I have receipts. I have information that WWE does not want getting out because it exposes just how dysfunctional things have become behind the scenes, and by the end of this video you're going to understand why this situation is way bigger than just a storyline, why real relationships are being destroyed, why careers are hanging in the balance, and why everything you thought you knew about Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar's friendship was apparently a lie. So hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because this is going to be the most important wrestling story of the year and you do not want to miss a single development as this nuclear situation continues to unfold. Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare because you can't understand the severity of what's happening now without knowing the history that led us to this breaking point. Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar have been connected for over 2 decades. When Brock debuted on the main roster in 2002, it was Paul Heyman who became his manager and mouthpiece, who helped establish him as the next big thing, who did the talking while Brock did the destroying. They had incredible chemistry. Heyman's gift for words combined with Lesnar's legitimate athletic ability and intimidating presence created magic. They won championships together. They main event WrestleManias together. When Brock left WWE in 2004 to pursue other opportunities, Heyman moved on to managing other clients. But when Brock returned in 2012, guess who was right there by his side again? Paul Heyman. And for the next decade, with a few brief interruptions, they were essentially a package deal. If you hired Brock Lesnar, you got Paul Heyman. If you wanted to negotiate with Brock, you went through Paul. Their relationship transcended the typical manager and client dynamic. They were friends. They were business partners. They trusted each other implicitly in a business where trust is rare and often misplaced. But then the bloodline happened. Roman Reigns, who had been struggling to connect with audiences as a babyface for years, finally turned heel and embraced his role as the tribal chief. And he needed someone to help him with his promos, someone to add gravitas and legitimacy to his presentation, someone who understood the business at the highest level. He needed Paul Heyman. And Paul, always the opportunist, always looking for the next big thing, saw potential in Roman that maybe even Roman didn't see in himself at that point. So Paul became Roman's special counsel, his wise man, his advocate. And this created an awkward situation because Paul was now fully committed to Roman Reigns and the bloodline, but he still had this decades-long relationship with Brock Lesnar. For a while, WWE tried to play it both ways. Paul would occasionally interact with Brock when Brock showed up for his sporadic appearances. There were moments where you could see the tension, where it seemed like Paul was being pulled in 2 directions, but it never exploded into full-blown conflict. Until recently. Until something happened that changed everything and turned Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar from lifelong friends and business partners into bitter enemies who can't even be in the same building without security being put on high alert. And what happened, according to my sources who work closely with both men, is that Brock Lesnar made it clear he wanted Paul Heyman to stop working with Roman Reigns and come back to working exclusively with him. Brock felt like Paul had abandoned him, like Paul had chosen Roman over their friendship, like all those years of loyalty and success meant nothing compared to whatever Paul was getting from his association with the bloodline. And Brock, being Brock, didn't ask nicely. He didn't sit Paul down for a calm conversation about their professional relationship. He confronted Paul backstage at a SmackDown taping several weeks ago and essentially gave him an ultimatum. Choose me or choose Roman. You can't have both. Pick a side. And Paul Heyman chose Roman Reigns. Not because he doesn't care about Brock. Not because their history means nothing to him. But because Paul is a businessman first and foremost, and from his perspective, Roman Reigns is the present and future of WWE while Brock Lesnar is a part-timer who shows up a few times a year, gets paid an obscene amount of money, and then disappears for months at a time. Paul wants to be at the center of WWE's most important storylines. He wants to be on television every week. He wants to be involved in the decision-making and the creative process at the highest levels. And you can't do that when you're tied to someone who's barely around. So Paul chose Roman. And Brock Lesnar lost his mind. The confrontation that followed, according to multiple eyewitnesses, was one of the most intense and uncomfortable things anyone backstage had ever seen. Brock got in Paul's face and started screaming at him, calling him a backstabber and a traitor and every other name you can imagine. Paul tried to explain his reasoning, tried to make Brock understand that this wasn't personal, that it was just business, that they could still be friends even if they weren't working together professionally. But Brock wasn't hearing it. He felt betrayed on a fundamental level. This was the guy who had been by his side for 20 years, who had been in his corner during his biggest matches, who had negotiated his contracts and helped him become one of the highest paid wrestlers in history. And now Paul was telling him that Roman Reigns was more important? That their friendship took a backseat to Paul's career ambitions? Brock couldn't accept it. Wouldn't accept it. Things got physical. Not a full-blown fight, but there was pushing and shoving. Security had to step in to separate them. And after that incident, Brock and Paul stopped speaking entirely. They avoided each other at shows. If they had to be in the same area, there was tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Other wrestlers and staff members started taking sides, creating factions within the locker room. Some people sympathized with Brock and felt like Paul had indeed betrayed their friendship. Others understood Paul's perspective and thought Brock was being unreasonable and possessive. And WWE management was caught in the middle, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that was affecting the entire atmosphere backstage and potentially creating liability issues if things escalated further. But then things got worse. Much worse. Brock Lesnar, feeling wronged and wanting revenge, started going out of his way to make life difficult for Paul Heyman and the Bloodline. Every time Roman had a big match or a big segment scheduled, Brock would mysteriously show up at the arena unannounced and cause chaos. He would interrupt promos. He would attack Roman or the Usos or Solo Sikoa. He would make it impossible for the Bloodline to function normally because there was always this threat of Brock Lesnar appearing out of nowhere and destroying everything. And Paul Heyman, who prides himself on being able to control situations and manipulate circumstances to his advantage, found himself completely powerless to stop it. He tried reasoning with Brock through intermediaries. He tried having WWE officials talk to Brock about respecting the show's format and not going into business for himself. Nothing worked. Brock was on a mission to punish Paul for choosing Roman over him, and he didn't care about the consequences or the collateral damage he was causing. This brings us to 2 weeks ago when everything reached a boiling point that set in motion the events I'm telling you about today. SmackDown was in the middle of a crucial segment where Roman Reigns was cutting a promo about his upcoming title defense, with Paul Heyman by his side doing what he does best, adding layers and depth to Roman's character with his eloquent and passionate advocacy. The crowd was into it. The segment was going perfectly. And then Brock Lesnar's music hit. The place exploded because nobody knew Brock was going to be there. He wasn't advertised. He wasn't on the internal rundown that production had. He just decided to show up and insert himself into the segment without permission from anyone. Brock marched down to the ring with that look of pure rage that he gets, and Roman's entire demeanor changed. The tribal chief suddenly looked concerned because Brock Lesnar, when he's legitimately angry, is one of the most dangerous human beings on the planet. Brock got in the ring and immediately went after Paul Heyman, ignoring Roman entirely. He grabbed Paul by his suit jacket and lifted him off his feet, and you could see the genuine terror in Paul's eyes because this wasn't a worked angle where everyone knows what's going to happen next. This was Brock Lesnar, who has legitimate mixed martial arts training and superhuman strength, manhandling a 60-year-old man who has no ability to defend himself physically. Roman tried to intervene, and Brock just threw him aside like he weighed nothing. The Usos ran down to the ring to help, and Brock fought them off too. It took half the locker room rushing out to finally pull Brock away from Paul, and by that point Paul was shaken up, his suit was torn, and he had the look of someone who genuinely feared for his safety. After that incident, Paul Heyman made a decision. He went to Nick Aldis, the SmackDown general manager, and he formally requested that Brock Lesnar be fired from WWE. Not just banned from SmackDown. Not just suspended until things cooled down. Fired. Contract terminated. Removed from the company permanently. Paul's argument was that Brock had become a danger to him personally and to everyone else in the company, that Brock was acting erratically and violently, that he was going into business for himself and disregarding the show's format and the safety of other performers, and that as long as Brock was employed by WWE, nobody associated with the Bloodline would be safe. Paul laid out a whole case with specific incidents and examples of Brock's behavior over the past several weeks. He talked about the backstage confrontations. He talked about the unauthorized appearances. He talked about the physical altercation 2 weeks ago. And he demanded that WWE choose between keeping him and the Bloodline, which are central to SmackDown's success and appear every single week, or keeping Brock Lesnar, who shows up sporadically and creates chaos whenever he does. Now, you have to understand the position this put Nick Aldis in. Nick is relatively new to the general manager role on SmackDown. He's trying to establish his authority and prove that he can run the show effectively, but he's also dealing with two of the most powerful and influential figures in WWE history. Paul Heyman is a legend who has been instrumental in some of WWE's biggest storylines and moments. He has the ear of Roman Reigns, who is the top star in the company. Firing Brock Lesnar based on Paul's request would keep Paul happy and keep the bloodline stable, which is good for SmackDown's week-to-week programming. But on the other hand, Brock Lesnar is Brock Lesnar. He's one of the biggest draws in wrestling history. He's a former UFC heavyweight champion with mainstream recognition that very few wrestlers have. He's someone who can sell out arenas and generate massive pay-per-view buys when he's advertised. Firing him would be a huge loss for WWE from a business perspective, and it would also set a precedent that talent can be fired simply because they're having personal conflicts with other talent, which is a dangerous road to go down. So Nick Aldis did what any reasonable authority figure would do in that situation. He denied Paul Heyman's request. He told Paul that while he understood his concerns and took them seriously, firing Brock Lesnar was not an option that he was willing or authorized to pursue. Instead, Nick proposed alternative solutions. He suggested that Brock and Paul could be kept apart by having them appear on different shows or at different times. He suggested bringing in mediators to help them work through their issues professionally. He suggested implementing stricter rules about unauthorized appearances and making it clear to Brock that any future incidents would result in severe financial penalties and suspension. But firing? That was off the table. Paul Heyman was furious. Absolutely furious. According to people who were in the room when Nick delivered his decision, Paul went on a rant about how Nick was making a huge mistake, about how this was going to end badly, about how Nick was prioritizing Brock's sporadic appearances over the safety and well-being of the people who are there every single week carrying the company on their shoulders. Paul accused Nick of being weak and of not having the courage to make the hard decisions that being a general manager requires. He threatened to go over Nick's head to Triple H or even to Vince McMahon if necessary to get the decision reversed. And Nick, to his credit, stood his ground. He told Paul that the decision was final, that he had considered all the factors and this was what he believed was best for SmackDown and for WWE as a whole, and that Paul needed to find a way to coexist professionally with Brock even if their personal relationship was beyond repair. Now we're in this incredibly volatile situation where Paul Heyman is furious that his request was denied, where Brock Lesnar knows he has leverage because WWE chose to keep him over firing him at Paul's request, and where Nick Aldis is trying to maintain order while managing two enormous egos who both feel like they've been wronged. And the ramifications of this are going to be felt across WWE for months, possibly years, because this isn't just about Paul and Brock's personal relationship anymore. This has become a power struggle that involves Roman Reigns, the Bloodline, SmackDown's creative direction, and the very nature of how WWE handles disputes between talent. Let me break down why this situation is so dangerous and why you should be absolutely riveted by what's about to happen. First, Paul Heyman is not someone who takes rejection well. He spent his entire career being a master manipulator who gets what he wants through intelligence, cunning, and political maneuvering. The fact that Nick Aldis denied his request is a blow to his ego and his reputation. Paul now has to prove that he was right, that keeping Brock Lesnar in WWE was a mistake, which means he has incentive to make the situation worse rather than better. Don't be surprised if Paul starts playing mind games, if he starts manipulating Roman and the Bloodline to escalate things with Brock, if he engineers situations that make Brock look bad and prove that he's a liability to the company. Paul Heyman when he's backed into a corner is incredibly dangerous because he's smart enough to hurt you in ways you don't see coming. Second, Brock Lesnar now knows that WWE values him enough to keep him employed despite Paul Heyman's best efforts to get him fired. That gives him an enormous amount of leverage and confidence. Brock could decide that he has carte blanche to do whatever he wants because WWE has essentially told him that his star power is more important than Paul's concerns. He could become even more aggressive in his attacks on Paul and the Bloodline. He could start making demands about his contract or his booking or how he's used on television, knowing that WWE is reluctant to push back too hard because they don't want to lose him. Brock emboldened and feeling vindicated is a terrifying prospect for anyone who has to work with him or deal with him backstage. Third, Nick Aldis has now made himself a target. By denying Paul Heyman's request, he's essentially chosen a side in this conflict whether he meant to or not. Paul is going to view Nick as an enemy, as someone who stood in the way of his safety and his goals. And Paul Heyman as an enemy is not someone you want to have because he will find ways to undermine your authority and make your life difficult. We could see Paul working behind the scenes to get Nick removed as general manager, or to make him look incompetent on television, or to turn the locker room against him. And on the flip side, if something happens between Brock and Paul in the future, if there's another violent incident or if someone gets hurt, Nick is going to be blamed for not taking stronger action when he had the chance. He's in a no-win situation where he's going to be criticized no matter what happens next. The SmackDown locker room is also feeling the effects of this situation. Wrestlers are being forced to choose sides, which is creating division and tension among people who should be working together as a team. Some people are firmly in Paul Heyman's camp, believing that he was right to request Brock's firing and that Nick Aldis made a huge mistake by denying it. These are mostly people who are aligned with the Bloodline or who have had negative experiences with Brock in the past. Others are defending Brock or at least defending the principle that you shouldn't be able to get someone fired just because you have a personal conflict with them. And then there's a third group that's trying to stay neutral and avoid getting caught in the crossfire, but even neutrality is becoming increasingly difficult as the situation intensifies and people are pressured to pick a side. From a storytelling perspective, this situation is both brilliant and terrifying. Brilliant because it creates unpredictability and genuine tension that you can't script or manufacture. When Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar are in the same building now, nobody knows what's going to happen. Will Brock attack Paul again? Will Paul orchestrate something to get back at Brock? Will Roman get involved to protect his Wiseman? Will Nick Aldis have to physically separate them or threaten serious consequences? That uncertainty makes must-see television because fans know that anything could happen at any moment. But it's also terrifying because WWE is playing with fire here. They're taking a real-life conflict between two people who have legitimate issues with each other and exploiting it for entertainment value, which means there's always the risk that things go too far and someone gets hurt or that the conflict bleeds into legal territory with lawsuits or criminal charges. Let's talk about what this means for Roman Reigns and the Bloodline because they're caught right in the middle of this mess. Roman has built his entire heel character around having Paul Heyman as his special counsel. Paul's promos and Paul's presence elevate Roman's character and give depth to everything he does. If Paul is constantly worried about Brock attacking him, if Paul is distracted by this conflict and unable to focus fully on making Roman look good, that affects Roman's presentation and potentially his drawing power. Roman also has to be concerned about the possibility of Paul leaving WWE if things get bad enough. If Paul feels unsafe or feels like WWE isn't protecting him adequately, he could decide to walk away from his contract, and then where does that leave Roman? Does he continue as tribal chief without his Wiseman? Does he find a new manager? Does his character fundamentally change? None of those options are ideal. There's also the question of whether Roman should or will get physically involved in the conflict. Brock attacked Paul, which is essentially attacking Roman's family and his authority as tribal chief. From a character standpoint, Roman can't let that slide without retaliating. But from a practical standpoint, does WWE really want Roman Reigns, their top champion and biggest star, getting into a feud with Brock Lesnar right now? That's a massive program that would require months of build and would dominate SmackDown's creative direction. Is that the story they want to tell, or were they planning something different for Roman? The Paul and Brock situation is forcing WWE's hand and potentially derailing other storylines because this conflict is too big to ignore. The business implications of this situation are staggering when you really think about them. Brock Lesnar's contract is reportedly one of the most expensive in WWE, paying him millions of dollars per year for a limited number of appearances. If things get bad enough, if Brock continues to go into business for himself and create problems, WWE might eventually have no choice but to cut ties with him despite his star power. But doing so would be admitting that Nick Aldis made the wrong decision by not firing him when Paul first requested it, which would be humiliating for Nick and for WWE management. On the other hand, if WWE keeps Brock no matter what he does, that sends a message to the locker room that the rules don't apply equally to everyone, that if you're a big enough star you can behave however you want without facing real consequences. That breeds resentment and creates an environment where other wrestlers feel like they're being treated unfairly. Paul Heyman's position is also complicated from a business perspective. He's under contract to WWE, but his value comes from his mind and his mouth, not from his physical presence in a ring. If Paul decided to stop coming to work because he felt unsafe, what could WWE really do about it? They could fine him or sue him for breach of contract, but that would create terrible publicity and make them look like they're forcing someone to work in an environment where they don't feel safe. And if Paul did walk away, WWE would lose one of the greatest managers and talkers in wrestling history, someone who was irreplaceable in many ways. You can train someone to wrestle. You can't train someone to be Paul Heyman. His decades of experience, his understanding of psychology, his ability to craft promos and manipulate emotions, those are unique skills that very few people possess. Let me address something that I'm sure some of you are thinking right now. Is this whole thing a work? Is WWE manufacturing this conflict between Paul and Brock to create a compelling storyline? I've asked myself that question multiple times while researching this situation, and my honest answer is that I think there are elements of both reality and storyline intertwined in a way that makes them almost impossible to separate. I believe that Paul and Brock really did have a falling out over Paul's decision to work exclusively with Roman. I believe there really was a backstage confrontation that got heated. I believe Paul really did request Brock's firing and Nick really did deny that request. But I also believe that WWE is aware of this conflict and is using it to fuel their television programming, allowing it to play out on screen in ways that blur the line between reality and fiction. That's actually the genius of what WWE is doing here, intentionally or not. They're taking a real conflict with real emotions and real stakes, and they're letting it play out in a way that feels authentic and unpredictable. The audience can sense that there's something real underneath the surface, even if they can't quite put their finger on what's worked and what shoot. And that creates an engagement level that you simply can't achieve with purely scripted content where everyone knows it's fake and nobody's genuinely upset with each other backstage. The reality adds weight and meaning to everything that happens on screen, but this approach is also dangerous because WWE is essentially playing with dynamite. When you encourage or allow real conflicts to play out on television, you lose some control over where things go and how they escalate. What if Brock really hurts Paul during one of their confrontations? What if Paul says something in a promo that crosses a line and makes Brock legitimately want to quit? What if Roman gets caught in the middle and ends up resenting both Paul and Brock for putting him in an impossible position? These are real risks that come with blurring the lines between reality and storyline, and WWE is betting that they can manage those risks without things spiraling completely out of control. The fan reaction to this situation has been fascinating to observe. Wrestling fans are generally pretty smart and can usually tell when something feels authentic versus when it's obviously scripted. And the Paul Heyman vs. Brock Lesnar situation has that feeling of authenticity that gets people talking and debating and analyzing every detail. Social media has been exploding with theories about what's really happening, what's going to happen next, and who's in the right. Team Paul people argue that he's justified in wanting Brock fired because Brock has been violent and unpredictable and has created an unsafe working environment. Team Brock people argue that Paul betrayed a 20-year friendship for his own career advancement and that Brock's anger is completely understandable. And Team Nick Aldis people, though there aren't as many of them, argue that Nick made the right call by trying to find a middle ground solution rather than firing someone based on personal conflicts. The wrestling media has also latched onto this story in a big way. Podcasters are dedicating entire episodes to discussing the situation. News sites are publishing multiple articles per day with new information and speculation. YouTube channels are pumping out videos analyzing every angle and every possible outcome. And all of this attention, all of this engagement, is exactly what WWE wants because it keeps their product in the conversation and makes people feel like they need to tune in every week to see what happens next. From a business standpoint, the controversy and the uncertainty are valuable commodities that drive ratings and generate buzz. Looking ahead, there are several possible directions this situation could go, and none of them are particularly comfortable or easy for WWE to navigate. Option 1 is that Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar somehow reconcile, either for real or as part of a work storyline, and they go back to being friendly or at least professional with each other. This would be the safest and most predictable outcome, but it would also feel anticlimactic after all the build and all the genuine animosity that's been displayed. Option 2 is that the conflict continues to escalate until WWE has no choice but to do something drastic, like actually firing Brock or moving Paul to a different brand or creating some kind of stipulation match where the loser has to leave the company. This would be dramatic and would give the storyline a definitive conclusion, but it would also mean losing either Brock or Paul, both of whom are valuable assets. Option 3, and this is the one that I think is most likely, is that the situation continues to simmer with periodic explosions of violence and confrontation, without ever reaching a full resolution. Paul and Brock continue to hate each other and continue to make each other's lives difficult whenever they're in the same place, creating ongoing drama and unpredictability for SmackDown. Nick Aldis continues to try to manage the situation and keep it from completely spiraling out of control, with varying degrees of success. Roman and the Bloodline continue to get caught in the crossfire and have to navigate the complications that come with having a Wiseman who's constantly worried about being attacked by a beast. This approach would allow WWE to milk the storyline for as long as they want without having to commit to a definitive ending, but it would also run the risk of the audience getting tired of it if it goes on too long without significant developments. There's also the possibility of outside forces getting involved. What if other wrestlers decide they've had enough of Brock's behavior and band together to force WWE's hand? What if someone from management above Nick Aldis, like Triple H or whoever the final decision maker is these days, steps in and overrules Nick's decision to keep Brock employed? What if Paul Heyman decides to take matters into his own hands and hire someone to take Brock out, creating a whole new layer of complexity and moral ambiguity? Wrestling storylines often work best when they have multiple moving parts and multiple characters with different motivations all colliding with each other, and this situation certainly has the potential for that kind of complexity. One thing I keep coming back to is the human element of this story. Regardless of how much is real and how much is manufactured for television, Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar are real people who had a real relationship that meant something to both of them. 20 years is a long time to work with someone, to travel with them, to celebrate victories and deal with defeats together. Even if they're playing up their conflict for television, even if they're being professional and doing what's best for business, there has to be some genuine sadness about the fact that their partnership has ended in this way. And I think that underlying sadness and loss is part of what makes the storyline resonate with audiences. We've all had friendships or partnerships that ended badly. We've all felt betrayed by someone we trusted. We've all had to make difficult choices between loyalty to the past and opportunities for the future. So even though this is playing out in the heightened reality of professional wrestling, the emotions at the core of it are very real and very relatable. The historical significance of this situation also shouldn't be overlooked. Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar together are responsible for some of the most memorable moments in modern WWE history. Brock's destruction of John Cena at SummerSlam. The end of The Undertaker's WrestleMania streak. countless other matches and promos and segments that are embedded in wrestling history. The fact that their partnership is ending not with a celebration or a retirement tour but with accusations and requests for firing and denied requests and ongoing animosity, that's tragic in a Shakespearean kind of way. These two titans who conquered the wrestling world together are now destroying each other, and there's something simultaneously compelling and heartbreaking about watching that unfold. I want to address one more aspect of this situation that I think is really important and doesn't get talked about enough. The precedent that's being set here matters for how WWE handles conflicts between talent going forward. If Paul Heyman's request to fire Brock had been approved, that would have established that personal conflicts and feelings of being unsafe are valid reasons for having someone removed from the company. That might sound reasonable on the surface, but it could also be weaponized by people who just don't like someone else or who see someone as competition for spots on the card. On the other hand, by denying Paul's request, Nick Aldis has established that personal conflicts alone aren't sufficient grounds for termination, which could be seen as protecting talent from false accusations or politically motivated attacks, but could also be seen as dismissing legitimate safety concerns. There's no perfect answer here, and whatever precedent gets set is going to affect how similar situations are handled in the future. The fact that you're still watching this video, the fact that you've made it this far through this incredibly complex and detailed breakdown, tells me that you're as invested in this situation as I am. You understand that what we're watching unfold with Paul Heyman, Brock Lesnar, and Nick Aldis is bigger than just another wrestling storyline. This is real people with real emotions dealing with real conflicts in a way that happens to be playing out on our television screens. And regardless of how it ends, regardless of whether Paul and Brock ever reconcile or whether one of them ends up leaving WWE, we're witnessing something that's going to be talked about and analyzed and referenced for years to come. So here's what I need from you right now. Drop a comment immediately telling me whose side you're on in this conflict. Are you Team Paul Heyman, believing that he was justified in requesting Brock's firing and that Nick Aldis made a huge mistake by denying it? Are you Team Brock Lesnar, believing that Paul betrayed their friendship and that Brock's anger and actions are completely understandable? Are you Team Nick Aldis, believing that he made the right call by trying to find a middle ground and refusing to fire someone based solely on personal conflicts? I want to hear every perspective because this is the kind of situation where there's no clear right answer and reasonable people can disagree about who's right and who's wrong. Hit that like button if this video gave you information and analysis that you haven't seen anywhere else. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because I'm going to be covering every single development in this story as it continues to unfold, and trust me, there are going to be major developments in the coming weeks. Share this video with every wrestling fan you know because they need to understand what's really happening behind the scenes with Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar and why this situation is so much more complex and consequential than most people realize. The Paul Heyman requests Brock Lesnar's dismissal story is just getting started, and based on everything I know and everything I've laid out in this video, things are about to get even more intense, even more complicated, and even more unmissable. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where hopefully we'll have more answers about where this insane situation is headed and how WWE plans to resolve or continue exploiting one of the most fascinating conflicts in recent wrestling history.